Arguments for God's existence are generally formed around the idea that some things can't be explained apart from the existence of God. Some of these arguments take the approach that God is the best explanation for things like, say, objective morality, meaning, and sentience. Of course, the validity and effectiveness of these arguments is going to vary to some degree. How these arguments are received will depend on how they're presented and to whom they're presented. So my goal here is not to repeat the common arguments. Instead, I'm going to try something new, or newish at least. And I totally accept responsibility for the fact that this thing is still a work in progress, okay? So I'm going to have some fun with this one. We'll see how it goes. And as I continue to work on it, I may make some adjustments for a future video. But in the meantime, let's just play with some ideas and see kind of what happens with this argument. Now, this is an argument that I came up with when I was a research student in philosophy. And since then, I've been tweaking it and kind of playing around with it for a few years. I'll call it the argument for God's existence from external world skepticism. Now, I realize I talk a lot about skepticism, but understand that that's really my wheelhouse. And before your eyes glaze over, let me just say this, okay? The basic idea behind this argument is that in a world of confusion, in a world of lies and deceit, of general epistemic chaos, where we may never be able to discern fact from fiction by virtue of our own cognitive ability, God is a stable and true source of knowledge. God is the answer to the problem of global skepticism. And as a consequence, He can provide an answer to our intellectual anxieties if we let Him. That's really it in a nutshell. But if you're curious about how this works out in logical form, here's the argument. Okay, so step one. We have to begin with the fact that it is an axiom of epistemology that I can't prove that I'm not deceived by an elaborate skeptical scenario, such that I'm a bodiless and vatted brain being fed the impression that I have a body and that there's a mind external world. Okay, that's just a fact, like it or not. So that's our starting point. Now, next step, based on what I just stated, I have to grant the possibility of a massive mind external deception, okay? We're going to call this skeptical scenario the skeptical hypothesis. But to be a credible deception that my mind can actually accept, the skeptical hypothesis would need to have explanatory power at least equal to the explanatory power of the real world hypothesis. In other words, my brain would be able to distinguish between the real and the fake, unless the fake was able to do the same work as the real. Now, if this is correct, the skeptical hypothesis would need to be isomorphic to the real world hypothesis. That is, it would need to be equally elaborate, creating kind of a mirror image of the real world in every possible way, okay? So for example, if this mirror image world were created by a supercomputer, that computer would need to be able to prevent the collocation of pseudo-objects, such as in the real world, by writing these pseudo-objects into physical locations on an actual three-dimensional computer disk. The deception would need to be so elaborate in mirroring the real world's simplicity and elegance that no computer imaginable could achieve this, all right? Now, the only entity capable of creating a deception as elaborate as the deception described previously would really need to be an omnipotent and omniscient being. Only some sort of extremely intelligent and extremely powerful sentient being could do this. In essence, only something godlike in intelligence and power could create the deceptive computer program or even engineer the deception directly. Only something godlike could create an elaborate and convincing isomorphic skeptical scenario capable of deceiving me and reproducing the simplicity and the elegance of the real world. Okay, so if such a being is necessary for the creation of an elaborate and convincing isomorphic skeptical scenario, then isomorphic skeptical scenarios are dependent on the existence of that omnipotent and omniscient being. Therefore, the possibility that the skeptical hypothesis is true would necessitate the existence of an omnipotent and omniscient being. Therefore, the skeptical hypothesis can only be true if an omnipotent and omniscient being exists. Okay, so far so good. However, a being who possesses the power and wisdom to create a deception would also possess the power and the wisdom to create a real world. Further, a being of power and wisdom is unlikely to be the kind of being that would intentionally try to deceive, since deception, that is a false representation of reality, would seem to be inferior to truth or reality itself. Therefore, the only plausible explanation for the skeptical hypothesis is also the solution to the skeptical hypothesis. And if that's true, then an omnipotent and omniscient being must exist. Therefore, isomorphic skeptical scenarios are probably false, and this would make the skeptical hypothesis false. Therefore, the real world hypothesis is probably true, and we don't have to worry about a massive global deception, okay? Now, I hope that was fun. But again, the idea is to get us thinking about the ways in which God's existence provides answers to some of the big questions surrounding meaning, existence, origins, and truth.